Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you. Increased stress is linked with teeth grinding and clenching, which causes poor sleep, jaw pain, and headaches. But did you know that 1 in every 4 adults grind or clench their teeth while they're sleeping? A Remy custom night guard can protect your teeth from grinding and clenching while saving you hundreds of dollars compared to getting one at the dental office. Use code GUARD20 for 20% off your order. Visit shopremy.com now. SHOPREMI.com.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I have John Virdin. He's the director of the Ocean and Coastal Policy Program at Duke University. We're going to talk about marine conservation and how humans use the oceans and work with the oceans. So, John, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. My pleasure.
Yeah, if you would, tell me about your background. How did you come to work on, maritime policy?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like many people, a bit of a zigzag, but yeah, my interest, my passion for a long time has been ocean policy, the rules of the game that governments make for how people use the oceans and interact with them, how we can protect them. And I'm particularly interested in ocean policy to reduce poverty, ocean policy to generate more jobs and food throughout the world, but particularly for communities that have fewer options. And the way I got into that, I was a political science major. I did a thesis on Nigerian debt dependency, was fascinated by just the disparity in wealth and income around the world. And it seems so stark to me, and what to do about that and levels of poverty. But then I just also love the ocean. And I went to Duke's Marine Lab for a summer after I graduated, and they sort of said, hey, you can combine these two things. There are lots of jobs in policy management, how people use the oceans that can help reduce poverty. And that did it for me. That hooked me. And I went back to grad school and then went into practicing that. Worked for 12 years at the World Bank, advising governments on policies for the oceans, and particularly for fisheries, where,
When you said use the ocean, I guess work with the ocean in order to alleviate poverty. What does that mean?
Yeah, so for me, I mean, it means essentially the oceans can provide more food, more fish, more seafood, provide more jobs for people if we have typically smarter rules of the game. If it's a free-for-all and you overfish, you clear out all the fish stocks, it's great for a little while, but then it's a boom and then it's a bust. And communities struggle. People are out of jobs, there's less food, and you can pick a lot of other different uses of the oceans and conflicts that occur there because we're overusing, overexploiting, polluting the oceans, and so it creates problems for so many of the benefits we enjoy from them. So getting good rules of the game, good policies, good laws for this crowded space on the planet that we all use and share can create more jobs and more food for people, and particularly in places that maybe don't have as many other options where they need them the most. So that's, for me, It's often been through the tropics, around the equator and places like that.
I don't know if this is right, again, because I'm a layperson, but for each country, I thought like 12 miles offshore is international waters. But I just learned, like in the U.S., I guess 3 miles offshore is state, and then I don't know how many miles is federal, and then I don't know what's international. But I guess the whole point is it difficult because the ocean is like a tragedy of the commons type thing?
Yeah, the oceans is kind of the classic commons, and then what happens when something is kind of used by all but really taken control by none, and that's where you had the United Nations Law of the Sea Treaty in the early 80s, sort of set as called by a lot of people like the Constitution for the Sea. And that sort of said, hey, here's who can make the rules for the oceans. And what it said is that out to 200 nautical miles from the coast, countries can make the rules. At least, you may not have absolute sovereignty over everything. You still have to let ships pass through and flights overhead. But in terms of things like fish stocks or minerals or oil or gas, you've got sovereign rights to those and to the rules of the game for those. And so that's about a third of the ocean that is now regulated by the countries, by the coastal states nearby those waters. But that also means there's about 2/3 of the ocean that we call kind of areas beyond any national jurisdiction, or like you think of it like the high seas, so to speak. And that's the current discussion at the UN right now is, hey, do we need a new treaty? And they're working on one, the high seas, for these 2/3 of the ocean that's not under the control or jurisdiction of governments, and all the biodiversity, the plants, animals, things that are out in those areas.
Well, what kind of, quote unquote, bad things happen, and where do they tend to happen? Where no one is in control, or do they happen in certain bailiwicks of certain governments, which makes it harder to tell them don't do that?
Yeah, I kind of think of the bad things in the ocean as under two big headings, and I got this from Jeremy Jackson, pretty famous marine ecologist, who said it kind of boils down to people taking out too much good stuff from the ocean and putting too much bad stuff in. And so the bad things happening, overfishing, extracting minerals, other resources, taking too much out of the ocean that disturbs the environment, the ecosystems, or compromises our ability to get these things in the future. And then we put a lot of bad stuff in, a lot of sewage, fertilizer runoff into the rivers and coasts that creates algal blooms and takes up too much of the oxygen in the waters, creates these dead zones in the ocean. Climate change, greenhouse gas emissions that are causing both ocean warming, and they're also causing the oceans to acidify in some places. Oil spills, on and on. So I think of it as those two problems, and those really happen really closely to the coast in a lot of cases because, that's where people are the most and have been the most. So that 1/3 of the ocean that's under government's control is where a lot of bad things have been happening, and governments have really been wrestling to get those areas under control. But now we're in this new age where technology is allowing us to push farther and farther into the oceans, and whether it's, to go farther out for fish or to go out and do deep sea mining for minerals that we need maybe for batteries, for electric vehicles, or maybe we're going to be prospecting for new organisms and new drugs and pharmaceuticals out there, you name it. that's where the concern is now, is that, hey, these areas aren't inaccessible. We can get there. The ocean is a frontier that we're, exploring and using more and more with new technologies. And if we just leave it as a free-for-all out there, we're going to have problems that we know we've had in the coastal waters and in the offshore. So that's why there's talk at the UN now about this new treaty for the biodiversity in those areas beyond government jurisdiction right now.
Yeah, I've heard that there's dead zones that are anoxic or hypoxic, and there's also, I guess, the various garbage patches or gyres. Are those located within any particular government's jurisdiction? And, are those governments angry and saying it's unfair, or, what's happening around those things?
Dead zones often are, because a lot of times they're linked to runoff along the coast and in the rivers. So, for example, in the U.S., there's always been it's growing big dead zone that occurs sometimes along at the mouth of the Mississippi in the Gulf, but also with things like plastics runoff, a lot of that's coming to the oceans via rivers as well as coastal runoff. But it's the plastic problem is governments are somewhat upset and angry about where that's happening. I think in some places, particularly if you're island states and you're saying, hey, this isn't coming from us. But a lot of these dead zones are happening within government's own waters. It's their own coastal runoff, their own ag industry.
So is your work crafting policy, or is it more research?
So my work is research to help people craft better policies. So a lot of what I'm working on right now with colleagues, work with Professor Javier Basurto at the Marine Lab, who's a governance expert, and work with colleagues at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, which is the UN agency charged with helping to reduce hunger, is on really understanding where the world's fishing communities are, what we think of as artisanal and small-scale fisheries around the world. They're the ocean's single largest employer, huge source of food and nutrition for communities around the world. Understanding, where these small-scale fisheries are, these big ocean users around the world, understanding the threats that they face, putting together the evidence for governments as to why they really need to pay attention to these small-scale fisheries, why they need to worry about these other threats they're facing, other uses and conflicts in the ocean. And trying to build the evidence base that these fishing communities, these artisanal fisheries, small-scale fisheries are, really big contributors to society around the world and need the attention of governments.
Remy night guards are designed for comfort. Remy sends you an at-home impression kit and has a team of in-house dental professionals to make you custom, comfortable night guards that you'll forget you're wearing, all for 80% less than the cost at the dental office. Visit shopremy.com to get yours now and take an extra 20% off your order with the code GUARD20 at checkout. Remember, that's shopremi.com.
So what are, you mentioned an upcoming, I guess, a summit where they're going to, who is running this? You mentioned this earlier, who is in charge of oceanic policy? Is it all nations, certain nations, and what's that called?
There's not like a global ocean agency or one World Ocean Organization that runs it all. So you have different agencies working on different things. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization works with UN member states on fisheries policy, amongst other things. So that's one aspect of in terms of fishing. In terms of this treaty I mentioned, this for biodiversity in the ocean in the areas beyond national jurisdiction, that is occurring in conjunction with the UN General Assembly. So the UN General Assembly, names a committee to lead negotiations amongst the countries, but it's all nations of the world coming together to see, are we going to put together a new treaty for this, for this area of the ocean that's somewhat ungoverned, uncontrolled right now. There's also a new, there's negotiations starting on a plastics treaty, and that's again through the United Nations Environment Assembly, similar to the UN General Assembly. And it's governments coming together to see, can they agree on a treaty that would bind them all to address plastic pollution. It's pretty early days on that one.
Well, of the various players, is everyone on board, or are there certain players that are not?
The countries and the governments have agreed to negotiate this, so process has started. I'm not sure the dynamics yet, who's taking what position on these, who's dragging their feet, who's really pushing it. I know on a lot of these treaties, whether it's the treaty for the high seas, the areas beyond national jurisdiction, or it's a plastics treaty, really the island states are often the ones that band together and really push for this because collectively, in total, they're kind of a powerful bloc, 40-ish, 50, however many small island states, but they call themselves sort of large ocean states. They control large chunks of the ocean, and for them, it's an integral part of their economy, their culture, and they will be really driving the other countries of the world to negotiate conservation treaties or ocean protection treaties that are stricter maybe than others might have pushed for.
Well, what are some of the major points that are up for consideration in this next round?
So for the plastics treaty, I mean, it's just starting, but I think of it as analogous to negotiations on climate change and the Paris Agreement. So if there's worry that there's way too much plastic going into the environment, polluting the environment, ending up in rivers and ultimately in the oceans, then the countries are we all going to set a binding target that we agree to abide by on reducing plastic pollution? Are we all going to agree on how we monitor and count that? Are we actually going to start banning plastic products of certain types? Or is this going to be, we all agree to start monitoring together how plastic is made, how it's disposed of? Do we agree that we're all going to report to each other and hope it's peer pressure? Those are some of the things that people are hashing out right now to see what type of treaty this is going to take shape. How is the world collectively going to respond to plastic pollution in the ocean?
Well, what are some early indicators, or are there particular ideas that are being advanced that you're considering, or what stage is it at?
I haven't taken part in the latest discussions. I mean, the ideas that are going forward is, do we have a target for total volume of plastic waste that we think is actually getting into the environment and into the oceans? Do we actually start capping plastic production, or do we have recycling targets? Do we think there can ever be enough recycling to get us to reduce plastic pollution? These are some of the things that are on the table right now. What role do big companies play? Should governments make companies who make the plastic responsible for disposing of it? And this idea of a circular economy, that you close the loop and reuse plastic and these types of products when they're made. Those are all some of the discussions that are happening and getting started right now. It's early to say, at least to my understanding, how those are taking shape, but these are some of the things I think that the negotiators are just starting to put on the table. It's going to be, these international treaties are a process of years and in some cases decades. I hope not decades here, but it's definitely years.
Where are we at in the process? Is there a fixed deadline where it's all submissions are going to be considered on this date? Or what's the plan?
They just kicked it off in February of 2022. So the United Nations Environment Assembly then, which is the kind of like the environment version of the General Assembly, they agreed to start negotiations on a treaty. So it just started in February of this year. I've understand that there's a target to conclude the negotiations by the end of 2024, but we'll see on that. That might be optimistic, but that's at least what I've understood is the plan. It started in February, and end of 2024 is when the target is to conclude negotiations on the plastics treaty.
Is there anything that can be done to accelerate it, or to do that might lead to some bad policy? Does it have to take a long time by definition?
No, it doesn't have to. It's just, imagine, as you said, there's not any one agency that can make everybody agree on this. It's a process of getting all the nations of the world, and particularly the biggest polluters, to agree. And the process is the time it takes to get them on board. And that's why when it comes to the international realm, it just takes this long because you're trying to get consensus amongst so many people. The Law of the Sea Treaty, the Constitution of the Sea, I mean, that's been called probably one of the biggest revolutions in the way that we use the oceans and humanity interacts with the oceans in the 20th century. But that took 30 years to hammer out. I hope, I don't think we're talking about that time frame. I hope not with the plastics treaty, but it's taken some time to get consensus on problems that are so big that span the whole planet.
So when people talk about the condition of the oceans right now, what are some of the things that that you're aware of that would give listeners an idea of the condition of the ocean and how things are progressing, how good they are, how bad they are, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean the big challenges I think that we face in the oceans right now that governments have agreed on to try to tackle, but that we're facing. One of the oldest is still a problem: overfishing. Of the fish stocks that we can measure and count, and it's not so easy to count them. There's the old joke that counting fish underwater is like counting trees, except the fish move and you can't see them. So, there are a lot of fish stocks we haven't measured, but those that we've counted and we've measured, about a third are considered overfished, and that number's held steady for a while. But there are a lot of others that are, can't take any more pressure sustainably. That doesn't mean they're being overfished, but it just means they can't be fished more. So there's we still have a handle to get on this old problem of overfishing. We haven't yet. We know how to do it. There's some good successes and models out there, but those are typically in wealthier, more temperate water countries. And a lot of the overfishing, at least we think, and pressure right now from fishing is taking place throughout the tropics in lower income countries and often by foreign fleets. And so getting a handle on that still remains a big problem and big challenge in the ocean. I would say, secondly, out of 3 or 4, we have and are still transforming coastal environments, coastal ecosystems. For 50 plus years, humanity's been increasingly migrating to the sea. Most of our big cities, our mega cities, are on the coast. We've been transforming coastal ecosystems that we all need and depend on, both to support plants and animals, but to protect us from storms that are getting worse under climate change. Mangroves, wetlands, seagrasses, coral reefs, oyster beds. I mean, a whole host of kind of natural coastal ecosystems have been transformed over the last 50 years. There's exciting restoration science underway to restore many of those, but that's something that needs to happen at scale, because through lots of sort of little transformations, you build a dock here, a jetty here, you build a seawall there. You could say that humanity's kind of progressively armored and geoengineered our coastlines. So that's a second big problem I would put. Third, excess nutrient pollution, the dead zones that we talked about, whether it's from sewage going directly into the ocean or fertilizer runoff from farms and the rivers and eventually the ocean. We're still putting a lot of loading nitrogen, phosphorus, extra nutrients into the coastal waters in places that are, as you mentioned, causing situations of hypoxia, anoxia, and dead zones. That's the third one. Fourth one, we've talked about, the plastic problem, the estimates of massive volumes, on the order of 11, 12 million tons per year of plastic entering the oceans is the fourth one. And then finally, we have all of the problems in just fundamental transformations of the ocean environment occurring because of excess greenhouse gases, because of human-driven emissions of greenhouse gases that are both causing the ocean to warm and are causing it to acidify and sea levels to rise. So those are the five big problems that I think of, that I see governments most frequently trying to do something about. That's where we're increasingly seeing young people try to innovate and come up with new technologies as well, new business models, you name it, to try to face some of these big problems in the oceans that, affect a lot of people's lives, whether you're on the coast or not.
I've spoken to a few people that are, I guess, trying to do some farming, let's say, of oysters and various shellfish and fish farms and all that. Do those at all help, let's say, the loss of fish populations? Can they help make areas sustainable in terms of fishing, or are they just a drop in the bucket of what's needed?
I think it's all helpful and contributes. I'm certainly not an expert in the area, but I understand from those that are that oyster farming, oyster aquaculture just has so many benefits. I mean, it improves the water quality. They're filtering the water, and it helps reduce pollution. Oysters are food as well, and jobs. Oyster beds can help protect the coasts as well. It's to some extent as natural defenses. So I've heard a lot of interest from people in increasing exactly that, oyster farming, oyster aquaculture, just because you get so many different benefits from it.
What about the gyres, the garbage patches? Are they just ugly, or are they seriously affecting, our ability to obtain fish from the ocean? Are they affecting the ocean's health, according to people that are studying them?
Yeah, so the gyres, and I haven't been out to them myself, but my understanding is yes, there's debris, trash there on the surface, but it's not just this sort of massive clutter of plastic and trash on the ocean surface. I mean, there's a lot of it in various stages at various depths underneath, and it's sinking to some extent. But it's not just in the gyres. There are these massive concentrations of plastic and debris by virtue of the currents, but there's increasing evidence and research showing, plastic in different forms throughout the ocean. And it's a real, we're still trying to understand how this is changing ocean wildlife, ocean animals, flora, fauna. Certainly it's a threat to a number of different species, whether it be seabirds or others that have struggled with either being, choked in plastic or eating it, ingesting it. But it's become pervasive throughout the ocean ecosystems. And so these gyres are kind of the most maybe visible or symbols of it. But the volumes of plastic waste that we think are going into the oceans, and that researchers are finding evidence in different species and things, goes beyond just those spaces and those gyres. And so it's a real concern for how this is changing the animals and species that live in the ocean.
Well, very good, John. Where's a place to find out more about your work and the upcoming summit, to discuss all these issues?
Yeah, thanks. I have a webpage on the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability that shows kind of the main things that I'm working on, which, as I mentioned, mostly is the study we call Illuminating Hidden Harvests, which is all about these small-scale fisheries throughout the world and how important they are to society. And there's a webpage with that at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, World Fish Center, as well as Duke. But yeah, all these things that I'm working on are pointed through the page on the Nicholas Institute site.
Well, very good. John, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Before you go, make sure to protect your smile from teeth grinding and clenching with a Remy custom night guard. Visit shopremy.com to get yours now and take an extra 20% off your order with the code GUARD20 at checkout.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.